what is CBT? Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. Cognitive, we're talking about thoughts. We're talking about the assumptions that are behind those thoughts. And then behind the assumptions, we have beliefs. So what we're really examining and exploring through CBT are distorted thinking patterns that have become habit thoughts, and the way we think about things have become very much a habit. So that's the cognitive part of CBT. The behavioural part of CBT, very basically, it's what we do and how we act. So that's behavioural. And then therapy, a treatment that helps someone feel better. So let's look a little deeper at cognition. There are 3 levels of cognition. The top level, which is very much a conscious level, these are when we're thinking, what's going through our mind, what thoughts are we having, what self-talk is going on, what stories are we telling ourselves, what narrative are we creating for ourselves. So that's the top level, the conscious level. Beneath those are what are called underlying assumptions. Now, this is where we impose meaning through the filters of our assumptions. They're subjective as opposed to being objective, and they're very much based on how we feel. Beneath the underlying assumptions are our beliefs. Our beliefs are very powerful, but we don't think to question beliefs. We accept them and we act according to them. So those are the 3 levels: top level thoughts, sub to those in the subconscious underlying assumptions, below those we have beliefs. So looking at that arrow, the top of the arrow there, that's conscious thinking, what's going through your mind, the self-talk, the narrative, the storytelling. Within cognitive therapy, the cognitive part of therapy, we talk a lot about automatic thoughts, usually negative automatic thoughts, or NATs. Sometimes they're called automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs. So these automatic thoughts, we aren't necessarily conscious of them. They happen automatically because we've practiced saying them to ourselves such a lot. And they're coming up from the subconscious, from our underlying assumptions, and those are coming from even deeper down, the beliefs. So our conscious thoughts and automatic thoughts may start off as being conscious, but they find themselves in the subconscious area. So we're not necessarily always consciously aware of them. I found this the other day, which was very timely because I've got this presentation to write. And it's by Carl Jung, or at least it's been attributed to Carl Jung, who was a psychotherapist many years ago now. He was, in terms of timeline, he was around the same time as Freud, who most people have heard of. And what he got to say about meaning: when you come to think about it, nothing has any meaning. For when there was nobody to think, there was nobody to interpret what happened. So think on. Next, we come to the behaviour aspect, what we do and how we act. We get used to behaving in certain ways, and these evolve in our behaviour patterns. We get used to thinking certain thoughts, with our thought patterns, and these result in the same or similar behaviours or actions. Now, if we had to reason every single situation, every single moment, every single day, from start to finish, each and every time, it'd be like Groundhog Day. It would actually be like having no memory of what happened before. And of course, memory plays a big part in how we approach situations in our lives. So at this point, it would be quite helpful, I think, just to talk very briefly about brain processing. 11 million bits of information are being processed by the brain at any given moment in time. 11 million of them. Of those 11 million bits of information, only 40 of those 11 million bits of information are actually conscious. So all of the rest of them, 11 million less 40, they are all subconscious. Now, these are processes such as keeping our body temperature maintained, monitoring body temperature and everything else that has to happen around our body temperature. It's about keeping us alive. That's what they're doing. They're keeping the heart beating, they are keeping the blood flowing, they are keeping us breathing, the lungs working. They are keeping all of the different systems, of which there are many throughout the human body. That is what most of the 11 million bits of information being processed by the brain are actually doing. Only 40 of them are conscious. And this information came from a gentleman called Manfred Zimmermann. I've referenced it here from 1986. It can actually be found before then, in the 70s. He was a neuroscientist, and this particular reference comes from Fundamentals of Sensory Physiology that was edited by Robert F. Schmidt. Okay, so how can CBT help with tinnitus? Well, CBT helps to reduce tinnitus distress. So this is when we are distressed by our tinnitus, when we're bothered by tinnitus. Distress comes about because something bothers us, and in this case, we're talking about tinnitus. Now, the only things that bother us are things that we attach importance to. If something isn't important to us, then it's not going to bother us. And when we don't care about something, we don't think about it. And when we don't care whether tinnitus is there or not, we don't notice it. So CBT helps with tinnitus in order to get us to a place where we don't care whether the tinnitus is there or not, because that way, that's when we're not noticing it. So what is distress? What do I mean by distress? I'm only talking about emotions, but these emotions are negative emotions. They make us feel really bad. So I've mentioned only 5 in that list there of negative emotions. There are many more, but these 5 are certainly 5 of the most common that people experience when they're distressed by their tinnitus. Fear, worry, sadness, frustration, anger. And emotions don't usually come along singly. They come along in clusters, and we experience at least 2 or 3 simultaneously. Some of them might be stronger than others, but there's rarely that we just experience one single emotion. So those are what cause us to be distressed, because we feel the distress through our emotions. Now, compared to those negative emotions, we've got lots of other emotions too. These are the very positive emotions. So feeling happy, experiencing joy, contentment, being excited, and love. So the distress are the negative emotions. Now, with cognitive therapy, we are basically looking at a process that is simplified here into 4 areas, one leading to another. Starting off with an event, something happening, a given situation, that leads to a thought about the event, that leads to a feeling, an emotion, how it makes us feel, that results in an action, in how we behave. So that is the fundamental process: event, thought, emotion, behaviour. So, a couple of examples here. Peter's got tinnitus and he's distressed because of it. So the event, he hears his tinnitus. Thought, oh no, I can't stand that. Leads to emotion, some of those negative emotions, feeling scared, worried, etc., that results in behaviour, having a meltdown, but certainly being very distressed. On the contrary, we've got here John. Now, John has tinnitus as well, but it doesn't bother him. So what happens with John? We've still got an event, because John does, if he hears his tinnitus, that's the event, he hears his tinnitus. So same event, but the thought was different. Oh, there it is. Never mind, I'll soon not be noticing it. Leading to no emotion at all, really. He's not going to feel anything. I've put contented because he might be. But basically there isn't an emotional reaction to it. So the behaviour, he just gets on with whatever he was doing. So his event doesn't lead to anything negative. Many of you will recognise this, I believe, where we have the same process going on, the event resulting in a behaviour, but this time we've got a conditioned response. So let's have a look at Peter again. Peter, who has tinnitus and is distressed because of it. What is happening with him, because this has happened so often, he hears his tinnitus, but he's not aware, he's not consciously aware of having the thought. He just feels. So the emotions are there, feeling scared, worried, whatever it is, resulting in a behaviour, having a meltdown, or certainly being very distressed. And the same actually for John, in terms of he's got tinnitus, doesn't bother him. His events, he notices his tinnitus, but he's not consciously aware of thinking, there it is, never mind, I'll soon not be noticing it. It runs straight through, there's no emotion, or he's just feeling perfectly happy and just gets on with what he was doing. So just as a reminder, this slide again about the 11 million bits of information being processed by the brain at any given moment in time, only 40 of which are conscious. So the 11 million less 40 are all subconscious. Where did the thought go? Well, the thought has actually gone down into the subconscious. So rather than it being a conscious thought, do you remember earlier on I mentioned to you about automatic thoughts? It's become an automatic thought, but it's just below the level of consciousness within the subconscious. So here we've got the triangle that's representing the whole consciousness, the 11 million bits of processing going on, with a tiny, tiny triangle at the top being the 40 bits of conscious processing. Of course, that triangle is far too big. It's not to scale. It should be much smaller, but we need to be able to see it on the screen. So that thought has actually slipped under the white line just into the subconscious. So how do we get from being bothered and even distressed by something to its opposite? We have to make changes. We have to make changes because we don't want to continue as we've been doing, not with all of that distress. It makes us ill. So the behaviour aspect of CBT, we use little and often, regular and consistent breath work for a start, because we need to alter the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is something that is within the middle, or emanates from the middle part of the brain. It is to do with the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. When we feel okay, they're nice and balanced. When we're stressed and when we are distressed, we have a lot more sympathetic nervous system activity going on than we do parasympathetic nervous system activity going on. And you don't need to remember these terms, but sympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system, the more activity there is in it, the more stressed we are, is actually a bit of an oxymoron in terms of it's really not very sympathetic to how we feel, because more of that gives us more anxiety, more of the symptoms of anxiety, and makes us feel really stressed and upset. So the use of little and often, regular and consistent breath work to alter the autonomic nervous system, plus using additional relaxation methods to improve physiological state overall. And basically, it's about building a new routine into your daily living. Right? So that's where the behaviour changes fit in. The cognitions, the changes here are where we learn to start challenging the thinking habits. Do you remember those patterns, those thinking habits I mentioned earlier on? Challenge those thinking habits that have been grown into. Identifying distorted thinking patterns and types of distorted cognitions that are used repeatedly over and over that lead us to feeling so bad. And to improve our ability to catch and to change automatic negative thoughts, because they are coming from underlying assumptions which are underlined yet again by core beliefs. So those are the cognitions, changes that we need to make. So a little bit more then about these automatic thoughts, underlying assumptions and core beliefs. They give us our interpretation of any given situation through thoughts and our emotional reactions of any given situation or occurrence. They're based on underlying assumptions. In other words, what do things mean to us? And these are emerging from our underpinning beliefs. So here's an example. Peter again. Oh no, I can't stand that. That was the automatic thought. The interpretation he interprets the tinnitus as bad, as being very unwelcome. He can't bear it. He feels scared. He's angry. So that's the top level, his interpretation that leads to, oh no, I can't stand it. The underlying assumption, Peter's assuming that he's stuck with this experience that he's having, and it is awful. Underneath the underlying assumption, we've got the belief. In this case, Peter believes that tinnitus is a terrible thing to have, and he can only be happy if the tinnitus goes, if the tinnitus isn't there, which is something called a conditional core belief. John, on the other hand, who has thought to himself, oh, there it is, never mind, I'll soon not be noticing it. His interpretation, he's interpreting the noise, the sound, as insignificant. So his underlying assumption is, well, he knows it's there, but he doesn't need to listen to it. And that comes from a belief that he'll not be noticing it before very long. So there's the example of those three levels again, but with the interpretation, the underlying assumption, and the belief. So where are they in terms of our consciousness and our subconsciousness? There they are. So with Peter, top of the triangle, we've got his conscious experience of emotions. In the subconscious, all of the rest is going on there. The interpretation that tinnitus is bad, it's unwelcome, he can't bear it, he's feeling scared, he's angry. With the underlying assumption that he's going to be stuck with this experience, it's going to be like it forever, and it is awful. And that tinnitus, the belief that tinnitus is such a terrible thing to have, he can only be happy if the tinnitus goes, having a conditional core belief. Whereas with John, his conscious experience was he just felt okay. There was no problem, no experience of emotions. All in his subconscious, his interpretation, no interpretation because it's just insignificance. That is the interpretation. Underlying assumption, John knows it's there, but he doesn't need to listen to it. Underneath that, his belief that he'll not be noticing it before very long. So where do these interpretations come from? Where does the meaning come from, those underlying assumptions? So the most common reasons for negative thoughts, for assumptions and for beliefs are cognitive distortions. Simply means distorted thoughts, distorted interpretations, distorted way of thinking. Now, there are many of them, but what I've done is I've broken them down basically into two groups. I've got the most common ones that I'm just going to talk very briefly to you about with an example, and then a list of the other fairly common ones that I see that people use a lot. So we all use cognitive distortions, by the way. It's part of our modus operandi. It's the way we view the world. It's the filters that we use to assimilate and to perceive what's going on around us in our lives. So certainly one of the most common ones is predicting the future. So predicting the future negatively without considering other outcomes. So an example might be, I'll never be able to cope with tinnitus. So this is where we turn our imagined future into an escalated, even version, inflated version of today. Whereas in actual fact, and we do know this intellectually, none of us has the ability to predict the future because we don't know what will happen, but we tell ourselves that we do. I'll never be able to cope with tinnitus. So you can just imagine having that kind of distorted way of thinking, predicting the future over and over again. That is why that would certainly lead to feeling very afraid, scared, etc. All or nothing thinking, another common one, also called black and white or polarized or dichotomous thinking. This is where you view a situation in only two categories instead of perceiving a range across a continuum. So an example might be, as long as I have tinnitus, my life is ruined. Black and white. Tinnitus, life ruined. No other way of seeing it. Okay, so all or nothing thinking. Minimizing the positive, maximizing the negative. So maximising the negative, only seeing the worst possible case scenario, minimising anything positive. So an example might be, I enjoyed being out with my friends today, but I had to cope with this tinnitus and it always spoils things for me. Even though at the time it didn't. But you tell yourself, because you remember that tinnitus spoils everything, so you get into maximising the negative, minimising the positive, telling yourself that anything positive doesn't count. So an example might be, I felt good being out with my friends today and didn't think much about the tinnitus, but that doesn't count. It's back as bad as ever now. So this is where we minimise anything good that's happened. Filtering, very similar to minimising the positive and maximising the negative, where we unreasonably tell ourselves that positive experiences or qualities don't count. So an example might be, well, just because the tinnitus doesn't seem so bad today, doesn't mean it's because of anything I've done differently. Even though you know you've been consistent in using the breathing exercise, using relaxation, and you're working toward changing how you deal with tinnitus. So, filtering. Emotional reasoning is certainly on a par with predicting the future, at the top of the pile, if you like. And I would say it probably just beats it by a head or a neck. Emotional reasoning is where you think something must be true because you feel it so strongly. And because you feel it so strongly, you ignore or discount any evidence whatsoever to the contrary. So an example might be, I'll never feel normal so long as I have this tinnitus. That's emotional reasoning. And then we've got blame, self-blaming and other blaming. Self-blaming, where you might blame yourself for everything that happens without taking into account external influences or any context. So an example that I do see a lot of, some of you might have it. My tinnitus is completely my own fault. I should never have gone to that concert. Blaming others, an example. Blaming another for what happens or has happened, but sidestepping any issue that there may be to take any responsibility for your own part. So an example might be, if that stupid man had been concentrating on his driving, there would have been no accident and I wouldn't have ended up having tinnitus. So blame. These are the remainder of them. I'm sure you all understand what they are. I don't need to give you examples of these. They are still done quite a lot. Catastrophizing, making things bigger than they probably really are. Mind reading, knowing what somebody else is thinking, even though you can't possibly get inside their heads and know, but we tell ourselves that we do. All or nothing thinking, jumping to conclusions, overgeneralizing, should or must statements, and labeling. So those are the main cognitive distortions. So what about negatives around using cognitive behavioural therapy? Are there any negatives around using CBT? In my opinion, only through how it is used, how it is presented to somebody. One of the issues that's a big issue that there is around CBT is it does tend to be thought of as being formulaic. And I'm talking about not just people who go and attend therapy sessions, for CBT sessions, I'm talking about therapists as well. They can tend to think in a very formulaic kind of way. For example, a therapist will usually start off forming something called a case formulation. So even that term, case formulation, sounds very formal, but also, when we use language, when we use vocabulary, it affects how we think about something. It affects our interpretation. So we've got this case formulation near the start. So might there be an unintended expectation that the patient or client, what he or she does and how he or she thinks, might there be an expectation that that person has got to fit the formula rather than the CBT process fit the person? I ask that question. Because if that is the case, then patient, client is then likely to be led into a similar mindset. So, for example, there's lots of, I hear them called it by people I work with about forms, because there are loads of forms in CBT. If I fill this form in, then X will happen. And sadly, in some cases, these forms aren't forms, but when your perception is that I'm looking at a form rather than I'm looking at a process of how I think, for example. If I fill this form in, then X will happen. You're going to fill a form in, and guess what's going to happen? X doesn't happen. And so when X doesn't happen, that person's going to be disappointed. And they're going to quite understandably say, well, CBT didn't work for me. And I have actually experienced this many, many, many a time from people who've come to me by saying, oh, I've done CBT before and it didn't work for me. And of course, once I've started exploring, asking them what it is they've done, they certainly haven't worked in the way I was taught and the way I work. So, in summary then, what does CBT do and how does it do it? Because we impose meaning on what we experience, that leads to giving us our mindset. Now, I was talking about language, vocabulary, not very long ago. Look at that word mindset. Just the word mindset sounds fixed. So we think of a mindset as something we can't change. And actually, a mindset isn't that at all. A mindset is an opinion about something. It is an opinion about something. And mindsets change. We can change our mind. And we frequently do about lots of different things. But when we are feeling low, when we are anxious, when we're stressed, then we develop a mindset. But it is a true, real experience, but it is still your interpretation. That is fundamentally, it's an opinion. So using CBT helps open us up to the blind spots that we use in our thinking when we're evaluating something, when we're judging things. It opens us up to see what we're missing, those blind spots. Now, this is achieved, behaviour change and cognition change evolve through brain plasticity. And brain plasticity is the ability, the fantastic ability that our brain has that helps us to change what we do and how we think.